From The Australian, here's what's on the front. I'm Kristen Amiot. It's Thursday, December 19. Alan Jones will plead not guilty to 34 indecent assault charges relating to incidents that are alleged to have taken place over nearly 2 decades.
I will not be engaging in a running commentary in the media. But I want you to understand this. These allegations are all either baseless or they distort the truth.
The veteran broadcaster was swamped by media and protesters outside Sydney's Downing Centre local court on Wednesday, but he won't return for future proceedings after New South Wales Chief Magistrate Michael Allen excused him from appearing in person. That exclusive story is live right now at theaustralian.com.au. The government will spend almost $60 billion this financial year, and it could drag out the central bank's fight against inflation. The Treasurer says the cash splash is unavoidable. But what does that actually mean? That's today's episode.
Well, we're rolling out very substantial cost of living help, because people are doing it tough.
On Wednesday, Jim Chalmers made it rain.
That's the motivation for the tax cuts, the energy bill relief, the cheaper medicines, cheaper early childhood education, the student debt relief, the rent assistance, and getting wages moving again. We've been able to find room in our budgets for cost of living relief.
In his mid-year economic and fiscal outlook update, also known as MYEFO, the Treasurer announced government spending will surge by just over $58 billion in this financial year.
This is a bit of a truth tonic. It tells us where our economy is heading, and particularly it gives us a really strong profile of the sea of red that awaits any government over the next 10 years.
Tom Dusevic is The Australian's policy editor.
So this is a pretty bracing set of numbers for anybody to look at. Our revenue miracle of the past few years is over, and now some of the forever spending pressures are coming home.
These new numbers will bump the government's share of GDP, that's gross domestic product, up to a level we haven't seen since the recession of the early 1980s and the coronavirus pandemic. And it means we're staring down the barrel of a decade of record budget deficits totalling more than $140 billion. But this uptick in spending doesn't include Labor's Future Made in Australia net zero investment scheme or its $16 billion plan to slash student debt. So what is the government splashing all that cash on? One of the most expensive items on the list is reforms to the National Disability Insurance Scheme, which the Treasurer says is unavoidable. There's also funding for welfare payments and pensions, plus an unexpected jump in demand for government services like Medicare.
One of the big drivers of the extra spending in the budget update today, as you know, and which is uncontested, is indexation of things like the age pension, working age payments and the like.
And there's a sneaky $5.5 billion election war chest, which will be used for cost of living relief measures, likely to be announced in the run-up to the next federal election. Jim Chalmers has deployed another of his trusty catchphrases to explain the government's $58 billion blowout.
Even if you look at the net policy decisions, $17.5 billion in net policy decisions, we think something like 94% of that is a combination of genuinely unavoidable, already provisioned, cost of living, or supported in a bipartisan way.
But what does that actually mean?
It's unavoidable in the sense that governments make choices. And once they make those choices, they decide on certain forever programs, basically payments on social welfare for programs. And some of those are linked to inflation, so it means that you have to do indexation. Sometimes you win on indexation in the sense that you've got to return a certain amount to the people receiving those payments. But at the other end, it punishes every wage earner through what we call bracket creep or fiscal drag, where wage inflation just basically pushes our average tax rates up. And so the governments tend to be winners from that, and they get a really big boost from revenue. So the two things net each other out. But in this case, Chalmers is just using a big excuse to try and point to those factors outside of his control as driving it. But that's not the full picture. The full picture is that in the main, the government's own decisions on spending is what is driving this blowout in the budget.
Of course, Labor is still waging a war against stubborn inflation and desperately hoping the Reserve Bank will cut interest rates before the next election in a bid to win back the trust of voters struggling under a cost of living crisis. It says pumping an additional $58 billion into the economy won't exacerbate the problem or prolong the agony.
The Reserve Bank Governor has herself said that public demand is not the main game when it comes to inflation and interest rates. And what we've been able to do with the very responsible way we've been managing the budget is we've seen inflation come off substantially. When we came to office, it was much.
But history tells us that the more money you put into people's pockets by way of bill relief and subsidised services, the more they'll spend on necessities like food and rent. But the more we pump into the economy, the harder it is to bring inflation down. So what gives?
The government here is being coy and not quite telling the full truth on this, because its own spending in this year, after you account for inflation, is going to go up by 5.7%. That's the kind of thing you do when you're in a recession or facing a crisis. But we're not there. Our unemployment rate is low. The economy is still growing. We've got new people coming into the country and making the size of the economy larger. But what you've also got is state and territory governments, some of them who've faced elections, have been spending like crazy on all sorts of things like public transport concessions, energy bill relief, those sorts of things. Just pumps more money into an economy. So as the great Chris Richardson says, that's more dollars chasing the same amount of goods in an economy, and prices rise. And that pushes up inflation, and that keeps interest rates high.
Coming up, the Treasurer's chickens come home to roost. Since winning government in 2022, Jim Chalmers has been quick to take credit for Australia's economic wins.
For the first time in almost 2 decades, Labor has delivered back-to-back budget surpluses. This is a really important demonstration of the...
And he hasn't hesitated to blame the opposition for leaving the government's books in what he says is a bad way.
The Labor government. When we came to office, these were 2 big Liberal deficits, and we've managed to turn them into 2 big Labor surpluses.
But deficits projected to plague the budget over the next several financial years means it's getting harder for Jim Chalmers to shirk responsibility.
After 3 budgets, and potentially a 4th, if Labor do hand down a budget on March 25 next year, Chalmers can no longer blame the coalition.
Jeff Chambers is the Australian's chief political correspondent.
I think for voters and business owners and others doing it tough out there, this is now Labor's cost of living crisis and housing affordability crisis to own. And it's going to be one of his great political challenges is to respond to that. So there's all types of high-level plays going on, but people should be expecting from both sides some really big promises. And the pressure for the coalition is to, instead of sitting in that rhetorical space, to actually put some meat on the bones and talk about where they will find savings. And Angus Taylor today, again, concerned about the political blowback, says it's not about austerity, it's about restraint.
Ahead of Wednesday's MYEFO announcement, the Treasurer characterised Labor's almost $60 billion blowout as slippage.
If this is Jim Chalmers' final budget announcement before a federal election. He'll be going to an election without being able to champion those surpluses, but rather defending a decade of deficits and higher spending under Labor. So they're saying that they need to spend on unavoidable automatic spending. Some of that is highly questionable given the links to Labor policy, but it comes down to a matter of whether or not the government has the courage politically to rein in some of that structural spending. It seems like they don't have that appetite, and that's where the pressure goes towards the coalition to see what their plan is. But ultimately, today's MYEFO was a really difficult one for Jim Chalmers to shine some positive light on.
Jeff Chambers is the Australian's chief political correspondent, and Tom Dusevic is our policy editor. You can read all our reporting and analysis of the government's mid-year budget update right now at theaustralian.com.au.